Homeless black man accused of assault, but he's a human rights lawyer. What happens when those who uphold the law become its victims? When perception outweighs truth? When justice is blinded not by principle, but by prejudice? This is the story of a man who set out to prove a point, only to find himself trapped in the very system he was trying to expose. The autumn air in Central Park carried a crisp chill, the kind that made people walk faster, tucking their hands into their coat pockets as they passed through the winding paths lined with trees shedding their golden leaves. Among the benches scattered along the main walkway, one, in particular, was occupied by a man who had become nearly invisible to the world around him. His clothes were worn, layered with patches of fabric barely holding together. His beard, thick and unkempt, covered much of his face, making it difficult to see the sharp intelligence in his deep brown eyes. To most passers-by, he was nothing more than another homeless man blending into the background of the city. But Marcus Brown was far from the man they assumed him to be. He sat in silence, observing, absorbing the rhythms of the park, the dynamics of the people who moved through it. He had been here for days, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he was studying something, testing a theory he had spent years contemplating. Marcus had once been a respected figure in the world of law, an advocate for justice, a defender of the underprivileged. Now, wrapped in the disguise of a forgotten soul, he was seeing the system from the other side. The way people glanced at him with suspicion, the way they crossed the path to avoid him, the way they saw only his exterior and made up their minds before he even spoke, it all told him exactly what he needed to know. Across the paved walkway, a sharply dressed man in his mid-50s strolled with an air of ownership, his Italian leather shoes barely making a sound on the pavement. James Cartwright exuded power, the kind that came from old money and years of wielding influence in boardrooms across Manhattan. CEO of Cartwright Investments, he had built his wealth off the backs of others, and he had little patience for what he considered to be the detritus of society. His morning walks through the park were a ritual, a way to clear his head before diving into another day of aggressive business dealings. Today, however, his routine was interrupted by a sight he found particularly offensive. Marcus sitting on a bench, unmoving, unbothered by the presence of those who clearly wished he would disappear. Cartwright slowed his pace, his grip tightening around the paper coffee cup in his hand. The irritation in his eyes was immediate. He stepped closer, his polished shoes stopping just inches from Marcus's worn-out sneakers. "You need to move along," he said, his voice edged with disdain. "This isn't a shelter." Marcus didn't respond right away. He had encountered men like Cartwright before, the kind who believed money equated to superiority, the kind who never had to fight for their dignity because it had been handed to them at birth. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I'm not bothering anyone," Cartwright scoffed. "You people always say that. But just by sitting here, you're lowering the quality of this place." He gestured around them, as if the park itself would agree with him. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this isn't your space." Marcus exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. He had spent his career navigating the minds of men like this, knowing exactly how they thought. He could predict the next steps of this interaction before they even happened. "The bench belongs to the city," he replied. "Same as it belongs to you." Cartwright's jaw tensed, his irritation growing into something sharper. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. And then, without hesitation, he tilted his coffee cup forward, letting the steaming liquid spill directly onto Marcus's chest. The burning sensation was immediate, the heat seeping through the layers of fabric, stinging his skin. Marcus shot to his feet, instinctively grabbing Cartwright's wrist and pushing him back. It was a simple defensive movement, but in an instant, Cartwright staggered, flailing his arms dramatically before crashing onto the pavement. The scene that followed unfolded in slow motion. Cartwright's expression twisted in exaggerated shock, his mouth opening wide as he clutched his chest. "He attacked me," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the park. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Phones came out, some recording, others dialing. "Somebody call the police, he just attacked me." Marcus took a step back, his hands raised slightly, not in surrender, but in disbelief at how quickly the narrative had shifted. The people nearby hesitated, watching with uncertainty, unsure of what had truly happened. But they knew one thing. When a wealthy white man pointed at a homeless black man and screamed for help, history had already written the ending. The sirens cut through the air minutes later, and a squad car pulled up fast. Officer Richard Nolan, a 15-year veteran of the NYPD, stepped out, his expression set in stone. He took in the scene. The businessman sprawled on the ground, the homeless man standing over him. That was all he needed. "Hands where I can see them," Nolan commanded, his hand resting on the holster of his weapon. Marcus didn't move right away. He could see the determination in Nolan's eyes. This wasn't about the truth. It was about appearances, about assumptions. He knew that arguing now would accomplish nothing. He lifted his hands slightly, his voice measured. "I didn't do anything," Cartwright groaned from the ground, shaking his head as if recovering from a vicious blow. "He just snapped," he gasped. "I was just walking and he jumped up and grabbed me like an animal." Nolan's fingers tightened on the grip of his gun. "Turn around. Now." A young woman in the growing crowd took a step forward. "Wait, officer, I saw what happened. That man—" "Step back, ma'am," Nolan snapped, his patience already gone. Marcus clenched his jaw. He knew what was coming next. He had seen it happen too many times to men like him. He slowly turned, his shoulders stiff as he felt the cold metal of the cuffs click around his wrists. As the officers led him toward the squad car, he caught sight of Cartwright sitting up, adjusting his suit jacket with the air of someone who had already won. Marcus could almost hear the press release forming in his head. The poor businessman attacked by an aggressive homeless man, saved by the swift actions of the police. The headlines would be predictable. But what Cartwright didn't know, what Nolan couldn't see, was that this story wasn't going to end the way they expected. Because Marcus wasn't just another statistic. He wasn't just a man without a home. And by throwing those cuffs on him without question, they had just walked straight into the very trap they thought they had set. He settled into the back seat of the police car, staring straight ahead as the doors slammed shut. He had prepared for this moment. What they had just done, assuming his guilt, disregarding the truth, choosing perception over reality, was exactly what he had set out to expose. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was filled with the quiet murmur of anticipation as people settled into their seats. The fluorescent lights cast a dull glow over the polished wooden benches, the air thick with the scent of old books and stale coffee. At the defendant's table, Marcus Brown sat in his orange jumpsuit, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. Across the room, James Cartwright sat with his lawyer, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, his hands folded neatly on the table, his face the perfect mask of a wronged victim. The prosecution's table was occupied by William Porter, a seasoned district attorney known for his aggressive style, a man who had built his career on securing convictions, especially in cases where the accused looked like Marcus. Porter rose, buttoning his jacket as he stepped toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and practiced. "What we have here is not a complicated case. A violent man attacked an innocent businessman in broad daylight, unprovoked and without reason. Mr. Cartwright was simply enjoying a walk in the park when the defendant, Marcus Brown, lashed out in a fit of rage. He turned, letting his gaze linger on Marcus for just a moment before continuing. We have a witness, Officer Richard Nolan, a respected member of the NYPD, who arrived at the scene moments after the attack and saw with his own eyes the aftermath of this brutal assault. His voice lowered slightly as he leaned in toward the jury. And let's not forget the background of the accused, a man with no job, no home, and no regard for the law. Is it so hard to believe that he would resort to violence? Marcus kept his face impassive, but he could see how the words landed. He had been in courtrooms like this before, though never on this side of the table. He knew exactly how juries processed cases like his. They wouldn't see the man in front of them for who he really was. They would see only what they had been conditioned to see. A homeless black man, unpredictable, dangerous. He could already feel the weight of their unspoken judgment pressing down on him. Porter turned toward the prosecution's first witness. Officer Nolan took the stand, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid. "Officer," Porter said, his tone respectful, "please describe what you saw when you arrived at the scene." Nolan cleared his throat. "When I arrived, the victim, Mr. Cartwright, was on the ground, clearly shaken. The defendant was standing over him in an aggressive stance. Given the situation and the victim's account, it was evident that Mr. Brown had been the instigator of the altercation." "And did you see any indication that Mr. Cartwright was the aggressor in any way?" "No," Nolan replied firmly. "He was the victim. That was clear." Porter nodded approvingly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Marcus watched as Nolan stepped down, his testimony leaving an impression on the jury. He had seen this strategy before. Make the case as simple as possible. Present the story as black and white, and let biases do the rest. The moment had come for him to speak. He stood up slowly, walking toward the jury with measured steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm but strong, "I ask you to look at me, not as the man they are trying to paint, but as a person. Just a person. Not a criminal, not a statistic, not someone who should automatically be feared because of how I look or where I was that day. I ask you to listen to the facts." He turned toward Cartwright, who shifted uncomfortably. "This man," Marcus continued, "threw scalding coffee on me. He provoked me, insulted me, and when I stood up for myself, he fell. He wasn't attacked. He wasn't harmed. He was embarrassed. And he knew exactly how to turn that embarrassment into an accusation." Porter scoffed, shaking his head. "Mr. Brown," he said, his voice thick with condescension, "do you have any proof of this supposed provocation? Or is this simply your word against the word of a respected businessman and a decorated police officer?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He reached into the small pile of documents in front of him and pulled out a USB drive. "Actually," he said, holding it up for the courtroom to see, "I do." A murmur rippled through the audience. Porter's smirk faltered slightly as the judge signaled for the evidence to be played. A bailiff inserted the drive into the courtroom monitor, and the screen flickered to life. The footage, captured from a security camera in Central Park, showed Cartwright approaching Marcus, his body language aggressive from the start. The courtroom watched as Cartwright threw his coffee onto Marcus, then stumbled backward dramatically when Marcus merely grabbed his wrist. The exaggerated fall. The immediate cries for help. The performance laid bare for all to see. A heavy silence fell over the room. The jurors shifted in their seats. Porter cleared his throat, fumbling for words. Cartwright's face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Nolan's jaw clenched, his fingers twitching slightly at his side. This was not how the case was supposed to go. Marcus took a step back, letting the footage speak for itself. He met the eyes of each juror, holding their gaze. "All I've ever asked for," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful, "is the truth." The judge turned to Porter. "Does the prosecution have any rebuttal?" Her tone was measured but carried an edge of impatience. Porter hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Cartwright, still stunned, opened his mouth as if to speak but then shut it again. He knew there was nothing he could say that wouldn't make him look worse. Nolan, however, was not ready to back down so easily. "This doesn't change the fact," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "that the defendant was behaving aggressively when I arrived." He resisted arrest. Marcus turned his gaze toward Nolan. "I asked you if you were going to listen to the witnesses. You refused. I asked if you were going to investigate before jumping to conclusions. You didn't." He took a slow breath, letting his words sink in. "And now, you're scrambling." The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The judge finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. Given the evidence presented, I see no basis for these charges to proceed. The case is dismissed. A stunned murmur filled the room. The bailiff moved toward Marcus, unlocking the cuffs around his wrists. He rolled his shoulders slightly, shaking off the stiffness. He had known he would walk out of that courtroom a free man. But what came next was far more important. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about how many others had sat in this same chair, accused without evidence, convicted without question. This was about a system that didn't need proof when the defendant looked like him. And it was about what happened next. What happened to the men who made this happen, the ones who had tried to turn another innocent black man into a criminal. As Marcus walked toward the courtroom doors, he could hear the low hum of reporters gathering outside. This story wasn't over. It was only the beginning. As Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, the sharp autumn air hit his face. But it felt different now. Crisper. Freer. The hallway was packed with reporters, microphones and cameras shoved toward him, voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of questions. He had expected this. Stories like his, where the wrongfully accused turned out to be someone far different than the system had assumed, always had a way of drawing attention. But Marcus wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He walked past them, his mind focused not on the media frenzy, but on the people still inside that courtroom. Officer Richard Nolan, standing rigid with his hands on his hips, jaw clenched, his face a shade of red that barely masked his frustration. James Cartwright, now sitting slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the prosecution table, knowing his reputation was about to be shredded. And William Porter, the once confident district attorney, shuffling his papers with an air of forced composure, trying to figure out how he had lost so spectacularly. The system had moved too quickly this time, too carelessly, and now they were caught in their own web of assumptions and arrogance. As he reached the courthouse steps, Marcus took a deep breath. A woman's voice called out, "Mr. Brown, will you be filing charges against Officer Nolan?" Another chimed in, "How does it feel to have your name cleared?" He turned, his deep brown eyes sweeping over the faces of the journalists, all hungry for a quote. His voice, when it finally came, was calm and steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about how many times this happens to people who don't have a camera proving their innocence, who don't have a platform to fight back." He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. What happened in that courtroom was justice. But it shouldn't take a surprise twist like this for justice to happen. That's the problem, and with that, he walked away, leaving the reporters shouting after him. The days that followed unraveled like a slow-moving avalanche. Small tremors building into something unstoppable. The security footage that had saved Marcus spread across news outlets and social media, dissected on primetime television, analyzed by legal experts, debated by talking heads. Every detail of his wrongful arrest became part of the national conversation. Questions arose, not just about the officers involved, but about the broader implications of cases like his. How often did this happen to people who couldn't defend themselves? How many had been convicted based solely on perception? The pressure mounted. Internal Affairs opened an investigation into Officer Nolan, digging into his record. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Complaints that had been dismissed, use of force incidents swept under the rug. Arrests based on little more than gut instinct and bias. One case turned into 10. 10 turned into dozens. A storm was forming around him. Cartwright, on the other hand, had no system to protect him. His name, once a mark of prestige, now trailed headlines filled with words like fraud and false accusation. His investment firm began to lose clients. Board members distanced themselves. His carefully built empire began to shake. He tried to stay quiet, hoping the news cycle would move on, but Marcus wasn't finished with him yet. With the help of a civil rights attorney, he filed a defamation lawsuit. The footage was undeniable. Cartwright had knowingly fabricated an assault, weaponizing the legal system to cover his own ego. The suit wasn't just about money, it was about principle, and this time, Marcus wouldn't be the one on trial. Meanwhile, the police department scrambled for damage control. Statements were released about commitment to fairness, about reviewing procedures, about listening to the community. But words meant nothing without action, and the public demanded more than statements. They demanded accountability. Nolan was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, though everyone knew what that really meant. He was being pushed out before the scandal could stain the department any further. The NYPD wanted the story to end quietly, but the people weren't letting it go. Marcus watched it all unfold with the patience of a man who had spent years fighting battles like this. This wasn't new to him. What was new was being at the center of it. He had always been the one representing clients who had been wronged, standing beside those who had been crushed by the system. Now, for the first time, he was the case. And that meant something. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wasn't interested in dismantling lives for the sake of satisfaction. He was interested in change. So, he used the attention he had been given, speaking out in interviews, advocating for reforms, pushing the conversation beyond just his own experience. This isn't about one cop. It's about a culture that assumes guilt before innocence, that lets bias dictate justice. His words resonated because they weren't just words. They were truth. It took weeks. But eventually, Nolan resigned before he could be officially fired. His career, once considered solid, ended in disgrace. The lawsuit against Cartwright moved forward, the evidence stacked against him too overwhelming for even the best defense lawyers to spin. He settled out of court, a public admission of guilt without the spectacle of a trial. The money meant nothing to Marcus. He donated most of it to legal defense funds for wrongfully accused individuals. The real victory was in exposing the truth. As winter settled over New York, Marcus found himself back in Central Park, standing at the same bench where it had all begun. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. The city around him moved as it always did, people hurrying past, lost in their own worlds. A few recognized him now, giving nods of acknowledgement, whispers of recognition passing between them. He sat down, hands resting on his knees, looking out at the space in front of him. He had come here weeks ago to test a theory, to see firsthand how the world treated those who were unseen, those without status or power. The results had been exactly what he expected. But what had happened after? That had been something else entirely. He thought about the men and women who had sat in holding cells just like he had, who hadn't been lucky enough to have a camera recording their innocence, who hadn't had the knowledge or resources to fight back. He thought about how easily his own life could have unraveled if just one detail had been different. A different judge. No video evidence. No witnesses willing to speak up. He knew that for every Marcus Brown who walked free, there were too many who didn't. And that knowledge wouldn't let him rest. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, Mr. Brown?" He looked up to see a young black man standing nearby, hands stuffed into his hoodie, eyes filled with something between awe and gratitude. "I just wanted to say what you did, what you're doing. It matters. A lot of us are paying attention." Marcus nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "Good," he said simply. "Then keep watching." The young man gave a final nod before walking away, disappearing into the moving tide of the city. Marcus sat for a while longer, letting the weight of everything settle. Then he stood, stretching out his limbs, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He had walked into this experiment with questions. He had walked out with answers. But the fight wasn't over. It never would be. He took one last look at the park bench before turning toward the city, toward whatever came next. This wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. At a tense custody hearing, a mother walked in just minutes late, still wearing blood-stained medical scrubs after facing an unexpected emergency on her way to court. But instead of being heard, she was stripped of her parental rights on the spot. leaving her world shattered in a single ruling. What will happen to her now? And how did things go so wrong for someone who only tried to do the right thing? The clock on the courthouse wall ticked past 9:14 a.m. in courtroom 2B of Charleston County Family Court. Tension hung in the air like southern humidity, thick, suffocating, and impossible to ignore. The room was packed. At the front, Charles Monroe sat confidently beside his lawyer, looking every bit the part. Expensive suit, pressed collar, a silk tie that screamed, "In control." Judge Howard Renshaw sat tall at the bench, 62, former military, known across the Carolinas for being rigid, punctual, and utterly unforgiving. He glanced at the clock again. "She's not coming," Charles's attorney murmured with the faintest smirk. "Your Honor," the attorney stood. "In light of the respondent's absence and failure to appear at the appointed time, we respectfully request the court proceed with a ruling in favor of my client." Judge Renshaw nodded, tapping his pen once against the docket. "This court has reviewed the documentation, the submitted evidence, and, in the absence of the respondent, hereby grants temporary full custody of minor child Sadie Monroe to Mr. Charles Monroe, effective immediately." The gavel slammed. The doors burst open. "I'm here!" The room turned as one. Standing in the doorway, breathless, was Dr. Elise Monroe, 38, trauma surgeon, mother, and completely out of place in this polished chamber of judgment. Her green scrubs were wrinkled, stained with dried blood. Her surgical badge still clipped to her side. Her hands trembled. One knee bore a scuff of dried asphalt. "Dr. Monroe," the judge barked, "you are late. This hearing has concluded." "Please, Your Honor, You were absent. This court has already ruled." Elise staggered forward, heart pounding in her ears. "I was helping someone who was dying," she said, voice raw, cracked from exhaustion and disbelief. "A man, hit by a car on Rutledge. No one stopped. I had to." The judge didn't flinch. "You had an obligation to be here. You were informed weeks ago. You were warned there would be no delays tolerated." Elise blinked, dazed. She tried to breathe, but her lungs felt frozen. "I wrapped his head. I kept pressure on his chest until the EMTs came. I rode in the ambulance. He's alive because I didn't drive past." Her voice broke on the last word. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Judge Renshaw remained unmoved. "This is a court of law, Doctor Monroe, not a medical bay. You chose not to prioritize your child's welfare today. That choice speaks volumes." And just like that, words meant to cut landed exactly where he wanted. Elise's knees gave slightly. She gripped the bench in front of her. "I didn't choose that over my daughter," she whispered. "I chose to be the kind of mother who stops when someone is broken. Because if it were my daughter lying in that street, I'd want someone to stop too." Judge Renshaw turned away. "You may appeal this ruling through proper channels. This session is over." The gavel struck again. And with that, everything Elise had fought for, the sleepless nights, the double shifts, the missed meals and story times, the letters from teachers, the therapy bills she paid alone, crumbled. Her hands, once trained to steady a scalpel mid-scream, now shook uncontrollably. She sat down hard on the bench, too stunned to move. Then she cried. Not delicate, contained tears. Not the kind you can wipe away in a quiet restroom. This was the ugly, guttural sob of a woman who just lost something sacred, a mother stripped of her role, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much. Charles didn't look at her. His attorney smoothed out his tie. Judge Renshaw stood and turned to leave, but someone in the back row, a court clerk in her early 20s, was holding her phone. And trembling. She had recorded the moment Elise burst through the doors, recorded her words, her uniform, her truth. 10 minutes later, the video hit Instagram. Caption: Doctor arrives late to court after saving hit-and-run victim. Judge refuses to listen. By 10:15 a.m., it had 200,000 views. By 10:45, it had reached CNN's newsroom. But Elise didn't know any of that. She was still in the courtroom, wiping tears from her cheeks with trembling hands. Her attorney, Sarah Colton, sat beside her, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. The courtroom emptied slowly. No one laughed, no one spoke. Except for one woman, a nurse sitting quietly in the back who approached Elise with gentle steps. She knelt beside her. "My sister's alive today because a doctor like you didn't drive past," she whispered. Elise looked at her, eyes rimmed red, still wet. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said softly. "I just wanted to be her mother." The nurse nodded. "You are." By noon, the video was viral. Respect the Scrubs, Let Her Be Heard, and Let Dr. Monroe trended across platforms. Reporters were calling the courthouse. Someone from NBC tweeted, "There's something wrong with a system that punishes the woman who shows up late only because she stopped to save a life." Still, Elise didn't care. Not yet. She was on the courthouse steps, head in hands, phone buzzing non-stop in her pocket. Sarah touched her shoulder. "Elise, there's something you need to see." She handed Elise the phone. Elise squinted at the screen, confused. Watched herself step through those courtroom doors. Heard her voice tremble. And then she saw the comments. "This is what Grace Under Fire looks like. She didn't fail her daughter. She showed her what strength is. I've never cried at a courtroom video before. Until now." Elise's hands covered her mouth. For the first time all morning, she wasn't crying because she was broken. She was crying because somehow people had seen her. And that was only the beginning. The courtroom was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from silence, but from impact. The kind that settles into the bones of every person present, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Elise Monroe sat hunched at the defense table, scrubs damp with a stranger's blood and her own silent devastation. Outside the courthouse, however, the world was shifting. The video of her emotional arrival had struck something deep in the collective conscience of the internet. It wasn't just a clip anymore. It was a statement, a reflection of a truth too many people had lived. That sometimes doing the right thing costs you the most. At 12:03 p.m., someone from Roper Hospital recognized her in the video and commented publicly, "That's Dr. Monroe. She saved a father of 3 this morning. He wouldn't have made it another 5 minutes without her. She ran from the ambulance to court." That comment changed everything. Back inside the building, Elise was sitting in a cold hallway chair, her attorney beside her, both staring at nothing when a court clerk jogged toward them, whispering rapidly into a phone. She paused, eyes wide, then turned to Sarah. "The judge wants you both back in courtroom 2B immediately." Sarah blinked. "Now?" The clerk nodded, lowering her voice. "He saw the video." Elise stood slowly, legs stiff from tension, heart unsure whether to hope or brace. They re-entered the courtroom where only moments ago she'd felt herself unravel. Now it was just Judge Renshaw, seated again, papers in front of him, but not touching them. His eyes were distant, unreadable. He didn't wait for them to speak. "I've reviewed something significant since the recess," he said, voice more measured, softer, even. "It has come to the court's attention that the circumstances of your late arrival may warrant a review of the earlier decision." Elise didn't dare exhale. Sarah, however, leaned forward. "Your Honor, if I may, we also have a witness who arrived during recess, prepared to speak to Dr. Monroe's actions this morning." Judge Renshaw looked up sharply. "Who?" The doors opened before Sarah could answer. Dr. Ronald Stratton, the head of Roper Hospital's emergency trauma unit, entered the room wearing his navy blazer over a surgical uniform and carrying a manila folder in one hand. "Sir," he began with a calm, steady tone, "I am here because Elise Monroe did something this morning that most wouldn't have." He walked up to the stand without needing to be sworn in, his credentials already verified by the court staff. At 8:26 a.m., Elise was on her way to this courthouse when a 911 call came in reporting a male victim, hit and run, bleeding out near Rutledge. EMS was delayed. She stopped, applied pressure to the arterial bleed, stabilized his airway, performed chest compressions twice, and rode with the victim all the way to our ER. If she had not been there, if she had not stopped, that man would have died. He's stable now, post-surgery, breathing, alive. He paused. The man's wife arrived 15 minutes later with their youngest daughter. They both asked the same question. Who saved him? We said, a woman in scrubs who ran from the scene the minute he was stable, because she had a custody hearing to get to. He handed the folder to the judge. Inside, a note written on crumpled pink paper in a child's handwriting read, "Thank you for saving my dad. You are my hero even if you don't know me." The judge read it slowly. His hand rested gently on the paper for a moment longer than necessary. He cleared his throat. "Dr. Stratton," he said quietly, "in your professional opinion, was Dr. Monroe negligent in her duty to this court?" The doctor didn't flinch. "She honored both duties the only way a real hero could. She chose life first. Then she came here to fight for hers." The room exhaled. Sarah sat straighter. Elise felt her breath hitch in her chest but held back the tears forming again. Just then, the courtroom doors opened again. A figure stepped in hesitantly. A man, bruised, bandaged, limping. The victim. The very man Elise had saved. "Excuse me," he said softly. "I don't mean to interrupt, but that woman?" He pointed at Elise. "She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't even give me her name. She just kept whispering, 'Stay with me, please stay,' like I was her family. I don't know anything about her legal situation, but I know this. She showed up for me when I was dying, and if that's the kind of mother she is, then her kid's the luckiest one in this building." The silence that followed was electric. For a full 30 seconds, no one moved. Then Judge Renshaw slowly turned to Elise. "Dr. Monroe," he said, no longer cold, "you said earlier that you didn't choose between your daughter and your patient, that you chose to be the kind of mother you'd want at your child's side. That stayed with me." He turned to the court reporter. "Strike all prior judgment rendered in this session from the record. Permanently." Sarah gasped. Elise covered her mouth with her hand, trying to keep control. The judge continued. "This courtroom has seen too many polished facades and well-dressed absences. But today, we saw someone show up bloodied, breathless, and raw. And she still held this room together better than most ever could." He turned to Charles, who had remained quiet throughout the second half of the hearing, watching his confidence drain like water from a cracked glass. "Mr. Monroe, unless you have an objection?" Charles's lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but Charles shook his head. He stood, straightened his tie, and said, "I withdraw my petition." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You what?" "I withdraw. She's not unfit. She's extraordinary." His voice was low, resigned. There was no fight left in him. The gallery rippled with emotion, murmurs blending with choked-back tears. Then, unexpectedly, Judge Renshaw stood. "Let the record reflect that the earlier ruling is vacated. Full physical and legal custody remains with Dr. Elise Monroe. A long pause. And let the record also reflect that scrubs are not disrespectful in this court. In fact, they're the clearest sign of what selflessness looks like. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, people began to stand. A woman near the back, a nurse, was first. Then a janitor, a clerk, a law student, Sarah herself, even the bailiff. They didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply stood. In recognition. In reverence. Elise sat frozen, unsure what to do with the moment, with the air pressing in on her chest from so much unspoken weight suddenly lifting. Slowly, she rose. Not for herself, but for the woman in the video. For the little girl waiting at home. For the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up. As Judge Renshaw exited the courtroom, he turned once more and said, "Dr. Monroe, thank you for reminding this court what honor looks like when it's too exhausted to wear a suit." Elise didn't say anything. She couldn't. But she smiled. And for the first time all morning, her hands stopped shaking. The story should have ended there. Custody resolved, dignity restored. The courtroom standing not in protocol but in tribute. But outside that courthouse, something far larger had already begun. The video of Elise's entrance, her trembling voice, her blood-stained scrubs, had not only gone viral, it had struck a vein in the heart of a weary nation. By nightfall, every major outlet had picked it up. CNN ran the headline, "Doctor scolded in court after saving life. The viral testimony of grace." Fox News called it, "Scrubs and Justice, where heart met the bench." MSNBC, ABC, NPR, they all replayed the clip of Elise walking into the courtroom, exhausted and apologizing, only to be dismissed before she could speak. But more powerful than the video were the comments that followed it. Thousands of nurses, doctors, paramedics, even school teachers and single moms flooded the thread, sharing stories of the times they were punished for doing the right thing. Missing meetings to tend to someone in need, being told they looked unprofessional after working double shifts, being judged for being human. Elise Monroe had become more than a woman in scrubs. She had become a mirror, and the country couldn't look away. Hospitals across the country declared Scrub Solidarity Week, encouraging staff to wear their uniforms proudly wherever they went. Social media exploded with the hashtag #Monroe Standard, a phrase coined by a high school student in Atlanta who posted, "Professionalism isn't about polish. It's about purpose." Elise's face was printed on shirts, murals, even a billboard in Times Square, though she didn't know it. Because while the world was watching, Elise was doing what she always did, showing up. 3 days after the hearing, she was back at Roper Hospital, working the night shift, comforting the mother of a car crash victim, holding an elderly patient's hand until his daughter could arrive. She hadn't taken interviews, she hadn't answered calls from producers or publishers, she hadn't read the op-eds or watched the news. She folded laundry, helped Sadie with her science project, paid the gas bill. When her lawyer forwarded a request from 60 Minutes, she replied, "I'm just trying to stay caught up on groceries." But the world wouldn't let her go unnoticed. 2 weeks later, Elise received a letter in the mail. Not an email, not a message request. A real, handwritten letter with a return address from Washington, D.C. Inside was a note from Senator Barbara Lanning, chair of the Senate Committee on Public Health and Safety. It read, "Dear Dr. Monroe, your courtroom testimony and the selfless action that preceded it have inspired a bipartisan effort to pass what we are calling the Monroe Clause, a federal provision that will ensure no emergency medical worker can be penalized for courtroom appearances made directly from shift. Your integrity has shifted not just hearts, but policy. Thank you for showing the country what honor looks like." She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, letter in hand, staring at the chipped mug she'd used that morning. She didn't feel like someone who had changed a law. She felt like a mother who was trying not to forget permission slips. That night, as she tucked Sadie into bed, the little girl whispered, "I saw a picture of you on someone's phone at school today." Elise raised her eyebrows. "Really?" "They were talking about how you saved a man, and how the judge got it wrong at first, but then he fixed it." Elise smiled gently. "Is that what they said?" "One boy said you were famous, like Beyoncé famous." Elise chuckled. "Well, I don't sing as well." Sadie looked up with wide eyes. "Are you going to be on TV?" Elise brushed a hand through her daughter's curls. "Maybe, but it's more important that I'm here. With you. Right now." The next morning, a box arrived on her porch. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was the pair of scrubs she'd worn to court, cleaned, pressed, folded, neatly, along with a letter from the Smithsonian Institute. They had officially requested to include them in their new exhibit, Modern American Courage. The display would stand beside firefighter gear from Ground Zero and boots from Hurricane Katrina responders. Elise didn't cry. She didn't smile broadly. She just placed the scrubs back in the box, hands steady, and whispered, "I didn't wear these to be remembered. I wore them because someone needed me." As momentum grew, so did the outreach. A curriculum developer from Minnesota created a unit titled Grace Under Pressure, Case Studies in Modern Heroism, built entirely around Elise's story. A hospital in Tulsa held a vigil honoring underappreciated emergency workers, naming Elise as their keynote speaker, even though she never made it there. She respectfully declined, writing instead, "I'm honored, but I already speak every time I walk into a trauma bay. That's where my voice is loudest." On the third Saturday after the hearing, something extraordinary happened. The city of Charleston declared a new civic holiday, Monroe Day, a celebration of everyday service, integrity, and quiet strength. City Hall held a small ceremony. Elise only agreed to attend because Sadie begged to wear a dress and present her mom with flowers. Elise stood on a modest wooden stage in jeans and a navy sweater, clutching her daughter's hand as the mayor read the proclamation. Cameras flashed. Applause rang. But Elise didn't speak in grand statements. She looked out over the crowd of nurses, teachers, EMTs, and janitors. People who knew what it meant to show up when no one was watching, and simply said, "Thank you for letting a moment remind us that what we do in the background matters." And that was it. She stepped down, walked into the crowd, hugged people who had never met her but felt like family. Journalists asked for quotes. She declined them all. 3 months later, Elise was back in court, not for custody but to testify in a public health funding proposal. The same judge, Howard Renshaw, sat behind the bench. When she took the stand, he gave her a long, almost reverent pause before nodding. She offered testimony, measured, articulate, compelling. As she stood to leave, he said, "Dr. Monroe, I was wrong, not just that day, but for too long before it. Thank you for making this courtroom better." She nodded once, eyes soft, and walked out without a word. Years from now, children will stand in front of a glass case in Washington, D.C., staring at a set of green scrubs. A plaque beside it will read, "Worn by Dr. Elise Monroe, surgeon, mother, witness. She showed up when it mattered most and taught a nation what strength looks like." Teachers will tell her story not because it ends in applause, but because it begins in truth. And somewhere, perhaps in a classroom or a clinic or a trauma bay, a little girl named Sadie will grow up knowing that her mother was never trying to be remembered. She was trying to make people feel seen. Because in a world obsessed with titles, image, and noise, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that speaks only when someone else needs it most. Elise Monroe didn't save a man that morning to make history. She saved him because it was the right thing to do. And somehow, in doing so, she didn't just keep his heart beating. She reminded the world what it means to be human. Under the warm golden light of an early summer afternoon, Rachel Porter pulled her station wagon into the gravel lot of Sonny's Corner Market, a modest store on the outskirts of East Hollow, Georgia. The once thriving town, built on the back of cotton plantations and railroads, had dwindled over the decades, leaving behind a patchwork of faded storefronts, empty lots, and resilient communities trying to carve out a life. Rachel stepped out of her dusty blue wagon, the vehicle a testament to years of careful maintenance and necessity. Her presence was striking. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms and grown stronger for it. Her crisp, white summer dress, paired with a worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder, gave her an air of practicality and grace. She was a stranger in town, but not so much that she stood out entirely. At least, not at first glance. For Rachel, blending in was part of the job. She wasn't here for groceries or idle conversation. As an investigator for the Georgia State Department of Justice, she was operating undercover to expose the deeply rooted corruption plaguing East Hollow's police force. Her mission was dangerous, and she knew it. But Rachel also knew that the work she did could change lives, could prevent others from suffering, as she had seen so many times before. Across the street, parked conspicuously outside the town's small post office, sat a police cruiser with 2 officers inside. Clint Hayes, a lanky man in his early 50s with a permanent smirk etched on his sun-weathered face, leaned back lazily in the driver's seat. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the world outside, but behind them, his sharp eyes were busy cataloging everything and everyone. Next to him sat Rick Morgan, younger by at least a decade but already hardened by the same cruelty that Clint wore like a badge of honor. Rick was built stocky, his uniform slightly too tight across the shoulders, and his restless energy betrayed a dangerous impatience. "She's not from here," Rick muttered, his gaze following Rachel as she entered the store. Clint tilted his head, watching her for a moment longer. "Nope," he agreed. "But that car of hers fits the description of the one we're looking for. Let's see if she's got a story worth hearing." Inside Sonny's Corner Market, Rachel moved purposefully through the aisles, picking up just enough to maintain her cover. A loaf of bread, some apples, and a bottle of sweet tea. The old man at the register, Sonny himself, nodded politely as she approached, his grizzled hands slow but steady as he rang up her items. "Don't think I've seen you round here before," he remarked, his voice friendly but cautious. "Passing through?" Rachel smiled, the kind of smile that didn't give too much away. "Something like that," she said. "It's a nice little town you've got here." Sonny chuckled, the sound tinged with the weariness of someone who had lived long enough to know how little things truly changed. "Nice enough if you keep to yourself," he said, handing her the paper bag. As Rachel stepped back into the sunlight, her instincts sharpened. The police cruiser hadn't moved, and now both officers were outside the vehicle, watching her with the kind of intensity that made her skin prickle. She knew this look. It was the prelude to trouble, the kind that too many black men and women in the South had come to expect when law enforcement was involved. Clint was the first to approach, his hands casually resting on his belt, the leather creaking softly as he walked. "Ma'am," he began, drawing out the word like molasses dripping from a spoon. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" Rachel turned to face him, her posture steady, her expression neutral. "Home," she said simply. "Why do you ask?" Rick joined his partner, circling around her like a vulture. "Funny thing," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed aggression. "Your car here matches the description of a vehicle involved in a robbery last night. Care to explain that?" Rachel didn't flinch. "That's impossible," she replied evenly. "This car hasn't left my driveway in days." Clint's smirk widened, and he stepped closer, invading her space. "Well, then I guess you won't mind coming down to the station to clear things up." Without waiting for a response, Clint gestured to Rick, who grabbed Rachel's arm and twisted it behind her back, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists with practiced ease. The groceries fell to the ground, apples rolling across the gravel as bystanders stopped in their tracks, watching in uneasy silence. No one dared intervene. Rachel didn't resist. Her mind raced, cataloging every detail of the interaction. The lack of cause, the way they skipped any pretense of investigation, and the blatant satisfaction on their faces as they led her to the cruiser. This was exactly the kind of abuse she had come to expose. And now, she was at the center of it. The ride to the station was silent, the air inside the cruiser thick with tension. Rachel stared out the window, her eyes tracing the familiar landscape of her childhood home. East Hollow hadn't changed much since she left it at 18, desperate to escape the weight of its history. The boarded-up church where her parents once worshipped still stood, its peeling paint a reminder of promises left unfulfilled. The diner where she worked her first job had been replaced by an empty lot, grass growing through the cracks in the asphalt. But the deeper rot, the one that had poisoned the town's soul, was still thriving. Clint and Rick were its latest enforcers, emboldened by years of unchecked power and a system that turned a blind eye. At the station, Rachel was led through the back entrance, past rows of desks where officers stopped to gawk at the new arrival. Clint shoved her into a chair in a small windowless room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Rick leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed. "You've got one chance to make this easy," Clint said, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "Where were you last night?" Rachel met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "At home," she said. Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's not what our witnesses are saying, and they saw you pretty clear." Rachel's heart pounded, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she let the silence stretch, watching as Clint's smirk faded, replaced by irritation. Rick, still hovering by the door, chimed in. "We've got evidence tying your car to the scene," he said. "And if you don't want things to get worse for you, you'll start talking." Rachel stayed silent. She knew the game they were playing. Every accusation, every threat, was another thread in the web they were trying to weave around her. But she also knew something they didn't, that their web was full of holes. The interrogation room in the East Hollow police station was a stark, fluorescent-lit box, its pale green walls a relic of another era. Rachel Porter sat at the lone metal table, her hands resting calmly in front of her, the handcuffs cold against her wrists. Across from her stood Clint Hayes, leaning forward with a predatory grin. Rick Morgan lingered by the door, his arms crossed, his bulk filling the narrow frame. "Let's try this again," Clint said, his tone mockingly patient. "Where were you last night, Ms. Porter?" "I've already answered that," Rachel said, her voice steady. "At home." Rick laughed, the sound harsh and sharp. "Lady, you think you're smarter than us, don't you? Sitting there like you've got nothing to worry about. Well, let me tell you, things can get a lot worse for you if you keep this up." Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she locked eyes with Clint, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. She knew from experience that silence could be its own weapon, one that unsettled even the most confident interrogators. Clint's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "You see this?" he said, pulling a plastic evidence bag from his pocket and tossing it onto the table. Inside was a wallet, scuffed, brown leather, and entirely unfamiliar to Rachel. "It's yours, isn't it?" Clint asked, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "Found it at the scene of the robbery. Funny how things just turn up in the strangest places." Rachel's eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Clint. "I've never seen that wallet before in my life." Rick pushed off the doorframe, stepping closer. "Oh, come on," he said, his voice rising. "You're really gonna sit there and lie to our faces? We've got witnesses, we've got evidence, and we've got all night to keep this going. So why don't you make it easier on yourself and confess?" Rachel's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not saying another word until my lawyer is present," Clint snorted. "You think we're gonna waste time waiting on some fancy lawyer to come down here? This is East Hollow, Mississippi. Porter, we do things a little differently here." Rachel's silence was her answer. Inside, her mind was racing. Every word they spoke, every misstep they made, she committed to memory. These men were sloppy, confident in their belief that no one would question their authority, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, just a few doors down the hall, rookie officer Emma Whitaker sat at her desk, poring over a stack of paperwork. At 27, Emma was new to East Hollow, having transferred from a larger precinct in Atlanta. She had grown up in a small southern town not unlike this one, and she had joined the force with the idealistic hope of making a difference. But her time in East Hollow had been an eye-opener. The camaraderie she had expected was absent, replaced by an undercurrent of tension and unspoken rules. And then there were Clint Hayes and Rick Morgan. Emma glanced at the folder in front of her. Rachel Porter's file was thin, too thin. The arrest report was rushed, full of vague statements and missing details. Something about it didn't sit right. Emma frowned, flipping through the pages again. Clint and Rick's reputation for targeting minorities had been a topic of whispered conversations among the younger officers, but no one had dared to challenge them openly. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the lights of the interrogation room glowed faintly. Rachel's calm, poised demeanor during the booking process had struck Emma as unusual. Most people brought in under Clint and Rick's heavy-handed tactics were visibly shaken, defensive, even combative. But Rachel had been different, controlled, purposeful. Emma's curiosity got the better of her. She opened her computer and began digging deeper, cross-referencing records and looking for anything that might shed light on the situation. What she found made her stomach turn, a pattern of arrests, all involving people of color, all following the same vague scripts. Missing evidence, falsified reports. The deeper she looked, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Back in the interrogation room, Clint's patience was wearing thin. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You think you're clever, don't you? Sitting there, all quiet, like you're better than us, but let me tell you something, lady. Nobody walks out of here clean, especially not someone like you." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" Clint's smirk returned. "You know exactly what I mean." Rick snickered, his laughter cutting through the tension. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean squat when the evidence points right at you." Rachel didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she shifted her focus to the clock on the wall, silently counting the seconds. She had been in worse situations than this, and she knew the importance of waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment came when the door opened and Emma stepped inside, her expression unreadable. Clint turned to her, irritation flashing across his face. "What do you want, Whitaker?" he snapped. Emma held up a folder. "I think there's something you should see," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about the case." Clint rolled his eyes. "We've got it under control." "I'm sure you do," Emma said evenly. "But this might change things." Rachel watched as Clint snatched the folder from Emma's hands, flipping through its contents. His smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. Rick peered over his shoulder, his brow furrowing as he read. "What the hell is this?" Clint demanded, his voice rising. Emma's gaze flicked to Rachel, then back to Clint. "It's the preliminary background check on Ms. Porter. Turns out she's not exactly who you think she is." For the first time since the interrogation began, Clint looked uncertain. He slammed the folder shut and turned to Rachel, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" Rachel met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Guess you'll find out soon enough." As Clint and Rick stormed out of the room, Emma lingered, her heart pounding. She knew she had just crossed a line, but something about Rachel Porter had ignited a spark in her, a sense of right and wrong that she couldn't ignore. Whatever happened next, Emma was determined to see it through. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of East Hollow's modest courthouse, casting long shadows over the rows of wooden benches. The air buzzed with quiet tension as people filed into the room, their murmurs filling the space with an electric anticipation. Rachel Porter sat at the defense table, her posture erect and her expression serene. Despite the handcuffs still binding her wrists, she wore a simple but well-tailored suit, her eyes scanning the room calmly as reporters jostled for space near the back, cameras flashing intermittently. Across the room, Clint Hayes and Rick Morgan sat confidently at the prosecution's table, their smirks and casual whispers a stark contrast to the seriousness of the proceedings. For years, they had operated unchecked, their abuse of power hidden behind a veil of authority. Today, they believed, would be no different. The gavel struck, silencing the room as the judge entered and took his seat. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. The case of Rachel Porter versus the state of Georgia. The prosecutor rose, delivering a theatrical opening statement that painted Rachel as a career criminal and a dangerous threat to the community. Clint and Rick exchanged smug glances as their fabricated narrative unfolded, bolstered by their so-called evidence. When the prosecutor finished, the defense attorney stood and gestured to Rachel. "Your Honor, with your permission, my client would like to address the court directly." The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Proceed." Rachel rose, the sound of her handcuffs clicking as she moved to stand before the judge. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the court, my name is Rachel Porter," she began. "I am not here today as an accused criminal but as an investigator for the Georgia State Department of Justice." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Clint and Rick froze, their smirks vanishing as they exchanged panicked glances. Rachel continued, her tone unwavering. "For the past 6 months, I have been working undercover to investigate widespread corruption within the East Hollow Police Department. My arrest yesterday was not the result of coincidence, but rather the culmination of a systematic abuse of power by Officers Hayes and Morgan, who have built their careers on targeting innocent people under the guise of law enforcement." She turned, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "I have brought with me extensive documentation, evidence gathered during my investigation, that details not only my innocence but also the actions of these officers." Rachel's attorney handed a thick file to the judge, who began flipping through it, his expression growing darker with every page. The prosecution faltered, their case unraveling as Rachel's revelations came to light. But the true turning point came when Emma Whitaker, the rookie officer, was called to the stand. The room fell silent as Emma approached, her face pale but determined. She took the oath, her hands trembling slightly as she sat. "Officer Whitaker," Rachel's attorney began, "can you tell the court what you discovered during your investigation into the reports filed by Officers Hayes and Morgan?" Emma glanced at Clint and Rick, whose faces had turned to stone. Then she looked at Rachel, drawing strength from her calm demeanor. "Yes," Emma said, her voice gaining confidence. "I found a pattern of falsified reports, missing evidence, and clear racial targeting in their arrests. The file on Ms. Porter was incomplete, rushed, and inconsistent with standard procedure. When I looked deeper, I discovered discrepancies in nearly every case they handled." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Emma recounted her findings. The defense presented emails, reports, and witness testimonies that supported her claims, painting a damning picture of the two officers' misconduct. Clint and Rick grew visibly agitated, their composure crumbling as the weight of the evidence mounted. When the defense attorney asked Emma why she had chosen to come forward, her answer was simple. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said. "No one should be above the law, especially those who are sworn to uphold it." The trial reached its dramatic climax when Rachel herself took the stand, laying out the full scope of her undercover work. She detailed how she had infiltrated the community, gathering evidence of systemic corruption, and how Clint and Rick's arrogance had ultimately been their undoing. "I knew it was only a matter of time before they targeted me," Rachel said, her voice steady. "I let them believe they had the upper hand, but all along, I was documenting their every move. Today, I stand before you not just to clear my name, but to ensure that justice is served, for me, and for every person who has been wrongfully targeted by these officers." The prosecution had no rebuttal. The evidence was irrefutable, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge delivered his verdict. "Officers Clint Hayes and Rick Morgan," the judge said, his voice heavy with anger, "you are hereby ordered into custody pending a full investigation into your actions. Your badges, once symbols of trust, have become tools of oppression. This court will not tolerate such gross abuses of power." Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the bailiffs approached Clint and Rick, snapping handcuffs onto their wrists. The irony was not lost on anyone. The enforcers of fabricated justice were now facing the consequences of their own corruption. Rachel watched as they were led away, her expression resolute. She had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The damage they had done could never fully be undone, but their downfall was a step toward healing and accountability. In the weeks that followed, Rachel's case became a national story, shining a spotlight on the pervasive issue of police misconduct. East Hollow underwent sweeping reforms, with new policies aimed at ensuring transparency and accountability. Rachel's bravery inspired others to come forward, sparking a broader movement for justice. For Rachel, the journey was far from over. She returned to her role as an investigator, using her experience to advocate for systemic change. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, she carried with her the knowledge that even in the face of overwhelming odds, truth and courage could prevail.